It would be one of humanity's oldest and most persistent economic struggles. It would remain a defining feature of ancient societies, from Mesopotamia to Rome, shaping the rise and fall of civilizations in ways that are still felt today. It is, of course, the story of debt, usury, and the shadow of bondage that followed those who borrowed but could not repay. The ancient world is dominated in the popular mindset by grand monuments and legendary battles, but there were many, many other dimensions to these civilizations. There were complex economic systems that, on their own, would qualify as remarkably sophisticated if it weren't for the fact that they existed thousands of years before modern banking. There was, of course, the brutal reality of debt slavery that trapped entire families, the desperate struggle between creditors and debtors that threatened social stability, and, of course, the ingenious solutions that ancient rulers devised to prevent their societies from tearing themselves apart. Money lending can be traced to approximately 3000 BC in ancient Mesopotamia, located in what is today's Middle East. This region was home to many different groups, including Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians. Before fiat currency was widely used, these ancient peoples understood a fundamental truth that would echo through the millennia. Those with surplus capital could profit by lending to those deficient in it. But this practice would inevitably lead to inequitable consequences, including literal debt slavery for those who defaulted. The advent of agriculture had created something revolutionary and dangerous in equal measure: the concept of future value. A farmer could borrow seeds in the spring with the promise of repaying the loan after the autumn harvest. This seemed perfectly reasonable, but it introduced a critical vulnerability into human society. What happens when the harvest fails? What happens when a storm destroys the grain, or drought withers the crops, or locusts devour everything in sight? In ancient Sumer, loan contracts date as far back as the 3rd millennium BC, and these represent some of the oldest legal documents known to historians today. The most notable of these contracts were created during the era of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, which controlled the Mesopotamian region in the very late 3rd millennium BC. These weren't simple handshake agreements between neighbors. They were formalized in writing, carved into clay tablets with cuneiform script, creating a permanent record that would survive for over 4,000 years. The loans themselves were varied and, judging by their possible permutations and written documentation, remarkably advanced for the time. To speak of loan contracts in the Bronze Age world essentially means discussing Sumerian loans. They reveal both the benefits and the dangers of borrowing. Commercial loans made in silver help move money from those who had surpluses to those with opportunities to deploy it, facilitating trade and economic growth. However, agrarian loans made in grain, typically at higher interest rates, often led directly to debt slavery. The concept of interest itself may have originated from the natural multiplication of livestock over time. The Sumerian word for interest, mas, also meant calves. The logic was beautifully simple and utterly compelling. Just as cattle multiply over time, shouldn't money lent out do the same? Especially when that money could have been invested in cattle instead? The ancient Greek word for interest, tokos, also meant the offspring of cattle, suggesting this conceptual link was widespread across ancient civilizations. But the economy of Sumer exhibited chronic labor shortages, which made debt slavery particularly valuable to creditors. When a borrower couldn't repay, sometimes the interest was to be paid in labor, perhaps by the debtor himself, a dependent, or a slave. This wasn't considered exceptional or cruel by the standards of the time. It was simply how the system functioned. The penalties for failing to repay on time could be extraordinarily severe, even for non-interest-bearing loans. A common practice was to double the amount due. For instance, in one loan where Su Asli received 25 jinn of silver from Azida, the penalty clause specified repayment at a rate of 2 gur of barley for each shekel of silver. Ordinarily, the price of barley was only around 1 shekel per 1 gur, meaning Su Asli would have had to repay the principal twice over in bushels of barley if he was late. Money lending during this period was largely a matter of private loans advanced to persons persistently in debt or temporarily so until harvest time. Mostly, it was undertaken by exceedingly rich men prepared to take on high risk if the profit looked good. Interest rates were fixed privately and were almost entirely unrestricted by law. Investment was always regarded as a matter of seeking personal profit, often on a large scale. Hammurabi began his 42-year reign as king of Babylon in 1792 BC. Today he's remembered primarily for his famous law code, a nearly 2-meter-high stone stele now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris. The code is severe, prescribing the application of lex talionis, the law of retaliation captured in the phrase "an eye for an eye," a tooth for a tooth. But what most history books fail to mention is something far more radical and consequential. Like other governors of the Mesopotamian city-states, Hammurabi repeatedly proclaimed the official cancellation of citizens' debts owed to the government, high-ranking officials, and dignitaries. Thanks to the deciphering of numerous documents written in cuneiform script, historians have established beyond any doubt that 4 general cancellations took place during Hammurabi's reign in 1792, 1780, 1771, and 1762 BC. The epilogue of Hammurabi's code proclaims that the powerful may not oppress the weak. The law must protect widows and orphans in order to bring justice to the oppressed. Article 48 addresses debt relief directly, stating, "Whoever owes a loan, and a storm buries the grain, or the harvest fails, or the grain does not grow for lack of water, need not give any grain to the creditor that year. He wipes the tablet of the debt in the water and pays no interest for that year." In Hammurabi's time, economic, political, and social life were organized around the temple and the palace. Those two closely enmeshed institutions, with their numerous artisans, workers, and scribes, constituted the apparatus of the state, not so very different in principle from modern governments. The peasantry was provided with land, which they rented, along with tools, draft animals, livestock, and water for irrigation, so they could grow food for the workers and dignitaries. They produced barley, their staple grain, along with oil, fruits, and vegetables, a portion of which they had to pay to the state as rent when harvested. As well as the land they cultivated for the palace and temple, peasants owned their own land, homes, livestock, and tools. When the harvest was poor, they accumulated debts. They also incurred debt through loans granted privately by high-ranking officials and dignitaries eager to get rich and to seize the peasants' property in case of default. If peasants were unable to pay off their debts, they could find themselves reduced to the condition of serfs or slaves. Indebtedness could also lead to members of their family being made slaves. This created an existential problem for the state. A society couldn't function if its tax base disappeared into debt bondage. A kingdom couldn't defend itself if its potential soldiers were laboring as debt slaves for private creditors. The ruling class recognized that unchecked debt accumulation threatened the very foundation of social order. Hammurabi's solution was revolutionary: periodic debt cancellation, known as misharum in Babylonian, meaning justice or equity. These proclamations restored equity, liberty, and family property by cancelling debts incurred for subsistence, including tax arrears owed to the state, while leaving commercial debts untouched. This distinction was critical. A merchant's loan to another merchant for a trading venture would be honored, but a farmer's debt for seed grain or a family's debt for basic survival would be wiped clean. When Hammurabi died in 1749 BC after his 42-year reign, his successor, Samsu-iluna, immediately cancelled all debts to the state and decreed the destruction of all debt tablets except those relating to commercial debts. Under the Hammurabi dynasty, the tradition of physically destroying the clay tablets on which debts were written became established. The public authorities kept precise accounts of debts on tablets stored in the temple, and during a debt cancellation decree, these tablets would be ceremonially destroyed, wiping the slate literally clean. Proclamations of general debt cancellation were not confined to Hammurabi's reign. They began long before him and continued for centuries afterward. There is evidence of debt cancellation as far back as 2400 BC, 6 centuries before Hammurabi, in the city of Lagash in Sumer. The most recent examples date to 1400 BC in Usury. In all, historians have accurately identified approximately 30 general debt cancellations in Mesopotamia between 2400 and 1400 BC. These proclamations were occasions for great festivities, usually during the annual spring festival. There were various Mesopotamian words for these cancellations: Amargi in Lagash, Nigsisa in Ur, Andurarum in Ashur, Misharum in Babylon, and Shudutu in Nuzi. The practice of decreeing debt amnesty was routinely triggered by significant events, particularly the death of a ruler. His successor would raise a golden torch and decree Andurarum, meaning restoration, establishing his reign on a foundation of renewed social equity. The stated purpose of such decrees was to establish or re-establish equity. A king's foremost duty was to maintain justice and equity. While lending at interest was not considered unjust in principle, debt that deprived families of their property and liberty created inequity, which had to be remedied. A decree of restoration could also be issued to address political or economic crisis. The usurper or conqueror, having subjected a people to his rule, could establish their restoration, both remitting debts and enabling those captured during hostilities to go free. Hammurabi himself did this upon conquering the kingdom of Lhasa. Thus, the conqueror could pose as a liberator, setting a disordered realm to rights. The issuance of debt-cancelling decrees was sporadic, not periodic, so one never knew when it would occur, but everyone knew it would happen sooner or later. This uncertainty was both a blessing and a curse. For debtors, it provided hope. For creditors, it meant they had to factor potential losses into their lending calculations, which may have served as a natural brake on predatory lending practices. In neighboring Assyria, the emperors of the first millennium BC adopted the tradition of debt cancellation. The practice spread beyond Mesopotamia to influence other cultures and legal systems. Most significantly, it became embedded in the religious and legal traditions of ancient Israel. In 432 BC, Nehemiah, the governor of Judah under Persian rule and no doubt influenced by the old Mesopotamian tradition, proclaimed the cancellation of the debts of all Jews who owed money to their wealthy compatriots. This occurred at the very time when the Torah was being compiled into its final form. The tradition of general debt cancellation became an integral part of Jewish religious law. The book of Deuteronomy requires remission of debts among Israelites every 7th year, using the term Shemitah, meaning remission, and stipulating that every creditor should remit the debt owed to him. The book of Leviticus went further, adding the requirement to proclaim amnesty, Hebrew deror, after every 7th cycle of 7 years, restoring every Israelite to his property and family in the 50th year, known as the Jubilee year. Recognizing that a predictable debt amnesty would make creditors' planning easier and might lead them to refuse loans as the 7th year approached, Deuteronomy specifically warns against this practice. The biblical authors clearly had experience with creditors' efforts to evade the requirement to remit debts. According to the book of Jeremiah, when Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, decreed deror in the face of the Babylonian invasion of 587 BC, creditors initially agreed to release their enslaved fellow Judeans, then found ways to force them back into bondage once the immediate crisis seemed to pass. This cat-and-mouse game between debtors seeking relief and creditors seeking repayment would become a recurring theme throughout ancient history. Far to the west of Mesopotamia, in the Greek world, lending had become common practice by the 6th century BC. Before this time, among a population consisting primarily of peasants and small farmers in Attica, the region surrounding Athens, borrowing occurred among members of local communities in the form of lending farming implements, small sums, and household goods. But when borrowing went beyond neighborly trading, debts for farmers and artisans became larger and more difficult to repay. Greek inheritance law made the situation worse. Unlike many cultures where only the eldest son inherited, Athens required equal division among all sons. This led to the fragmentation of land into smaller and smaller portions that could not sustain a family. Farmers were forced to borrow just to survive. In ancient Greece, the power of creditors over the persons of their debtors was absolute, and as in all cases where despotic control is tolerated, their rapacity was boundless. Society was dominated by an aristocracy of birth, the Papyri, who owned the best land, monopolized the government, and were themselves split into rival factions. The poorer farmers were easily driven into debt by them and, when unable to pay, were reduced to the condition of serfs on their own land and, in extreme cases, sold into slavery. Sales of property on credit, or debts against property, were commemorated by horoi, inscribed stone markers set up on mortgaged houses or land as a way of notifying the public. These stones stood as permanent reminders of indebtedness, visible to all who passed. A debtor could use his freedom, or that of his family, as security for a debt, leading to slavery upon default. Farmers subject to oppressive arrangements were loosely known as hektemoroi, indicating that they either paid or kept a sixth of a farm's annual yield. In the event of bankruptcy or failure to honor the contract stipulated by the horoi, farmers and their families could be sold into slavery. The main problem at Athens was the discrepancy between a small group of elites owning most of the arable land and a large group of dependent smallholder tenants who had access to land only through them. As more poor farmers fell into debt and slavery, their hatred of the aristocracy grew. The poor and landless demanded that the large estates be broken up and redistributed to them. Civil war and the rise of a tyrant threatened the peace of Athens. Seeing disaster looming, both the aristocracy and common people of Athens supported the election of Solon as primary archon in 594 BC. The Athenians granted Solon, then about 35 years old, nearly unlimited powers to write new laws to end the conditions that had caused all the hatred and fear. Solon was the son of an Athenian aristocrat, but his father had apparently lost the family fortune. As a result, the young Solon became a merchant to support himself and his family. He led a modest life and never sought great wealth. Solon also became the first noted poet of Athens, and much of what we know today about his ideas and views comes from his poetry. Solon's first priority was to provide debt relief for the poor, which he called seisachtheia, meaning shaking off of burdens. By decree, Solon cancelled all debts. He restored the land poor farmers had lost to their aristocratic creditors. He released those in debt, slavery, and banned offering one's own body or those of family members as security for a loan or rent. He granted amnesty to those who had fled into exile because of their indebtedness. Solon recorded his reforms in verse, writing, "These things the black earth could best witness for the judgment of posterity, from whose surface I plucked up the marking stones planted all about, so that she who was enslaved is now free. And I brought back to Athens many who had been sold, justly or unjustly, or who had fled under the constraint of debt, wandering far afield, and no longer speaking the Attic tongue. And I freed those who suffered shameful slavery here, and trembled at their master's whims." Solon also removed the horoi from farmers' lands, eliminating these public markers of debt and shame. The removal of the horoi clearly provided immediate economic relief for the most oppressed group in Attica, and it brought an immediate end to the enslavement of Athenians by their countrymen. Some Athenians had already been sold into slavery abroad, and some had fled to escape enslavement. Solon proudly records in verse the return of this diaspora, though it has been cynically observed that few of these unfortunates were likely to have been recovered. It has also been noted that the Seisachtheia not only removed slavery and accumulated debt, but may also have removed the ordinary farmer's only means of obtaining further credit. This was an unintended consequence that would create its own problems. Nevertheless, Solon's reforms fundamentally changed Athenian society and laid the groundwork for the eventual development of Athenian democracy. Solon rejected the notion that a god, a king, a tyrant, a single class, or even he himself could save Athens. Instead, he believed that all citizens, rich and poor, were responsible for achieving the common good of the city. This idea about the meaning of citizenship was revolutionary. He rejected seizing the great estates of the aristocrats and redistributing their land to the poor, recognizing that such radical action would destroy support for his reforms among the wealthy. After implementing his reforms, Solon famously left Athens for 10 years of self-imposed exile, traveling the Mediterranean world. He did this partly to prevent himself from being pressured to modify his laws, and partly to allow the Athenians time to adapt to their new social order. His reforms would not prevent all future conflicts, and Athens would still experience periods of tyranny, but he had established fundamental principles that would shape Greek political thought for centuries. In Rome, the relationship between debt and bondage took on a particularly harsh character. The Roman legal system included a form of debt bondage called nexum in the early Republic. Within the Roman legal framework, it was a form of mancipatio, a formal transfer of property. Though the terms of the contract would vary, essentially, a free man pledged himself as a bond slave, known as a nexus, as surety for a loan. He might also hand over his son as collateral. Although the bondsman might be subjected to humiliation and abuse, as a legal citizen he was theoretically supposed to be exempt from corporal punishment, though this protection was often more theoretical than real. Nexum was finally abolished by the Lex Poetelia Papyria in 326 BC, in part to prevent abuses to the physical integrity of citizens who had fallen into debt bondage. Debt bondage was described as quite normal in classical antiquity. The poor or those who had fallen irredeemably into debt might place themselves into bondage voluntarily, or more precisely, might be compelled by circumstances to choose debt bondage as a way to anticipate and avoid worse terms that their creditors might impose on them. Many forms of debt bondage existed in both ancient Greece and Rome. In the Greco-Roman world, debt bondage was a distinct legal category into which a free person might fall, theoretically temporarily, distinguished from the pervasive practice of slavery, which included enslavement as a result of defaulting on debt. Both enslavement for debt and debt bondage were practiced in Ptolemaic Egypt, showing how these practices spread throughout the Mediterranean world under Hellenistic influence. The history of slavery in ancient times reached its peak in Rome. The Roman people expanded their borders outside the Italian peninsula, enslaving their prisoners of war. Many people sold themselves into slavery to cover debt, or applied for loans using enslavement as collateral. Roman people struggling to make ends meet abandoned their infants and sold their children into slavery. Depending on the crime, some criminals could be sold into slavery for their sentence. Money lending in Rome primarily involved private loans given to individuals who were consistently in debt or temporarily so until harvest time. This practice was typically carried out by extremely wealthy individuals willing to take on high risks if the potential profits seemed promising. Interest rates were set privately and were largely unrestricted by law. Investment was always regarded as a matter of seeking personal profit, often on a large scale. Banking was of the small backstreet variety, run by the urban lower middle class of petty shopkeepers. By the 3rd century AD, acute currency problems in the empire drove such banking into decline. The rich, who were in a position to take advantage of the situation, became the moneylenders when the increasing tax demands in the last declining days of the empire crippled and eventually destroyed the peasant class by reducing tenant. Farmers to serfs. We know remarkable details about the consequences of personal debt in Roman Egypt because they come down to us, along with thousands of other day-to-day documents, in the form of papyri. Toward the end of the 3rd century AD, Aurelia Tisus, an illiterate weaver from the city of Memphis in Roman Egypt, lost her father but inherited his debt of 18,000 silver drachmas. As a single woman with no assets, she was forced to seek help to deal with the debt. The woman who lent her the money to settle the debt was no philanthropist. Aurelia still had the original debt held against her, and the lender, from the village of Caranis, had rights over all Aurelia's property until the debt was paid. Instead of paying interest on the loan, Aurelia had to provide her weaving skills and household services to the lender on a full-time basis. Given the unlikelihood of Aurelia ever being able to pay back the loan, by signing a document she could not read, she was essentially selling herself, because of her father's debt, into domestic servitude for the rest of her life. But it's not just papyri that tell us about the practice of lending money to those in need in the Roman Empire. The recently deciphered Bloomberg tablets, discovered in the city of London, show that loans were a part of everyday life across the whole empire. From Pompeii, we have graffiti from tavern walls, showing how much was lent and what had been pledged by pawnbrokers on the security of clothing or small personal items. The annual interest rates on these pawnbroker loans varied between 45% and 75% per annum, remarkably similar to the rates demanded by high street pawnbrokers today, but substantially below the rates required by some modern loan companies, which can exceed 1,000% per annum. The empire was very aware of the dangers of loans at high interest rates. Since avoiding social unrest was a key aim of Roman provincial government, the state intervened to try to prevent the worst excesses of loan shocks. Many of the loans given in Roman Egypt were peer-to-peer, meaning between individuals of similar status. Some of them were literally payday loans. In AD 140, Antonius Heronianus, a cavalryman of the first cohort of a Roman military unit, had to borrow a sum in silver denarii from his comrade Iulius Serenus, which he promised to pay back with interest once he had received his pay. However, most loans in an agriculturally dominated society such as Roman Egypt were payday loans in the sense that the debt would be repayable after the payday of the harvest. Though some workers might be able to survive minimally from their compensation, uncontrollable life events such as illness required loans. Families, including children, worked day and night to prepare rice for export by boiling it, drying it in the sun, and sifting through it for purification. Roman law attempted to limit interest rates, and this attempt had some success, though there are many examples of loans at higher rates, particularly for smaller amounts of money. As ever, it was the smaller borrower who paid the higher rates. There was a simple way around such restrictions. In some cases, the actual amount ultimately paid to the borrower was smaller than that recorded in documentation. In addition, in Roman Egypt, the total interest payable could never exceed the capital borrowed. These legal constraints would have been toothless unless the state was willing to enforce them. Evidence from the papyri shows an even-handed approach. Defaulting debtors could be imprisoned, but those who felt they had a grievance against a lender had the right to appeal to the authorities. The system wasn't perfect, but it represented an attempt to balance the interests of creditors and debtors while maintaining social stability. Throughout the ancient world, philosophers and religious leaders grappled with the moral implications of lending at interest. During the Sutra period in India, from the 7th to 2nd centuries BC, there were laws prohibiting the highest castes from practicing usury. Similar condemnations are found in religious texts from Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Plato worried that lending could lead to social instability. To him, lending often demonstrated a lack of regard for the poor, not too different from the perception of loan sharks today. Aristotle believed that of all the methods for making money, usury, which he defined as predatory lending, was the most contrary to nature. He argued that money was meant to be an intermediary in exchange for goods, and charging interest for its use was fundamentally unjust. In ancient Greece, interest was generally accepted as reasonable, since it seemed fair for a lender who risked his money to receive a profit in return. Within society, lenders were often highly regarded as their willingness to risk their money through lending encouraged trade and helped boost the economy. Interest rates were generally lower in ancient Greece than in Mesopotamia. The general limit was 12%, with mortgages and larger loans having interest rates closer to 16 and 18% respectively. Religion played a significant role in condemning the lending of money at interest. The Quran and Bible renounced interest completely. The Torah allowed Jewish people to lend at interest to non-Jewish people, but not to fellow Jews. Early Islamic writing specifically considered interest as undeserved income. The Bible condemned usury, specifically when lenders would charge interest to the poor. The New Testament taught giving rather than loaning money to those who need it. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them, expecting nothing in return. The New Testament also taught abstinence from being in debt. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. These religious prohibitions would shape medieval European attitudes toward money lending and banking, creating complex legal and social structures to work around these restrictions. The tension between the practical necessity of credit and the moral condemnation of interest would remain unresolved for centuries. As ancient societies became more complex and urbanized, professional moneylenders emerged who made their living primarily or exclusively from lending. These individuals occupied an ambiguous social position. On one hand, they provided essential services to communities, making credits available for everything from commercial ventures to emergency needs. On the other, they were often viewed with suspicion and hostility, particularly when they exploited desperate borrowers. The term loan shark is modern, but the phenomenon is ancient. In every civilization that permitted lending at interest, there emerged individuals who charged rates that were considered excessive and who used coercive methods to collect debts. The practice of making loans that are seen as unfairly enriching the lender is called usury, from the Latin usura, meaning interest or use. Someone who practiced usury could be called a usurer, though we might now call such a person a loan shark. The line between legitimate lending and loan sharking has always been contested and culturally defined. What one society considered reasonable interest, another might view as exploitation. What one era tolerated, another prohibited entirely. Professional lenders developed various strategies to maximize their profits and minimize their risks. They specialized in understanding their borrowers' circumstances, calculating with precision how much debt a person could sustain and what forms of security or collateral would protect the loan. They created networks of informants who could identify potential defaulters. They developed legal expertise to use the courts to their advantage. Some lenders focused on the wealthy, financing commercial ventures and political ambitions. Others specialized in small loans to the poor, the ancient equivalent of payday lending. These small-scale lenders often operated from shops or stalls in marketplaces, available to anyone who needed quick cash for an emergency. The interest rates they charged were typically much higher than those for larger loans, reflecting both the greater administrative costs of many small transactions and the higher risk of default among poorer borrowers. The Mesopotamian tradition of periodic debt cancellation represented a remarkably sophisticated understanding of economic dynamics. Ancient rulers recognized that unchecked debt accumulation would destroy the tax base, undermine military strength, and eventually threaten the stability of the state itself. The regular wiping clean of debts served as a kind of economic reset button, preventing the permanent concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a creditor class. But this tradition gradually declined and eventually disappeared. The last confirmed debt cancellation in Mesopotamia dates to around 1400 BC. The ensuing centuries are known by historians as the Dark Ages of Mesopotamia because of the dearth of written records. However, we do have evidence of violent social struggles between creditors and debtors during this period. In Rome, despite the abolition of nexum, the practice of debt bondage continued in modified forms, and no tradition of general debt cancellation ever took hold. The Roman elite firmly believed in the sanctity of contracts and the absolute rights of property owners. The idea of debt cancellation was seen as a dangerous attack on property rights that would undermine the entire social order. This Roman attitude toward debt would prove consequential. As the empire expanded and inequalities grew, debt became an ever more powerful tool of social control and economic exploitation. The rich became richer by lending to those in need at high interest rates. The poor became poorer as they fell deeper into debt. The middle classes, the backbone of the Roman military and economy, were gradually crushed between these two forces. Many historians argue that this debt crisis contributed significantly to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. As peasant farmers were reduced to tenant status or driven off their land entirely, agricultural production declined. As the urban poor fell into crushing debt, social unrest increased. As the middle classes disappeared, the military's recruitment base eroded. The empire became increasingly brittle, unable to respond effectively to external threats or internal challenges. The contrast between the Mesopotamian approach and the Roman approach is striking. In Mesopotamia, rulers periodically cancelled debts to preserve social stability and state power. In Rome, the sanctity of debt was maintained regardless of the consequences. Mesopotamian civilization endured for thousands of years, with various empires rising and falling, but the basic social and economic structures remaining relatively stable. Rome, for all its military might and cultural achievements, lasted less than 1,000 years before fragmenting.